Good evening and welcome to the Walters Art Museum. My name is Julia Marchiari Alexander and I am the Andrea B. and John H. Laporte Director of the Walters. As an integral part of the Walters work to expand understanding of the histories of people and objects that we steward, and in order to create broader awareness of the histories that have led us to our present moment, I will begin this evening's program by reading the museum's Indigenous Land and Cultural Heritage Acknowledgement. The Walters Art Museum acknowledges the Piscataway and Susquehannock nations that originally inhabited this land. We also acknowledge the tribal nations, most notably the Lumbee, who migrated here, and indigenous peoples whose ancestors are represented in the objects we steward in our collection. Thank you. It is so wonderful to see visitors back in the auditorium. And on behalf of all of the staff and the Board of Trustees, please join me tonight in thanking the Boshell Foundation, some of the members of which are here with us tonight. And that is for their generous support. The Boshell Foundation, based in Texas, has a deep relationship with the Art Institute of Chicago and the Dallas Museum of Fine Art. The Walters is in terrific company. Since 2004, but especially over the last 7 years, the foundation has been a true partner to the Walters in the pursuit of the museum's goals of education, open access, and engaging the public in fascinating and innovative scholarship. Since 2017, the Boshell Lecture Series here at the museum has invited internationally renowned scholars and authors, archaeologists, and historians to present free lectures on a wide variety of topics related to the museum's collection, with a particular focus on the art, the cultures, and peoples of the ancient world. With that context, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Solange Ashby. Dr. Ashby will speak tonight about the Kingdom of Meroë, a land renowned for its archers, abundant gold, and strength against challenges, which is actually a topic that I find quite timely given all that we are facing in our own world today. Dr. Ashby received her PhD in Egyptology with a specialization in ancient Egyptian language and Nubian religion from the University of Chicago. Her expertise in sacred ancient languages, including Egyptian hieroglyphics, Demotic, Coptic, Ethiopic, Biblical Greek, and Biblical Hebrew, underpins her research into the history of religious transformation in Northeast Africa and Southwest Asia. Dr. Ashby's first book, Calling Out Isis, The Enduring Nubian Presence at Philae, explores the Temple of Philae's history as a Nubian sacred site. Dr. Ashby has been awarded a prestigious President's Postdoctoral Fellowship at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her current research describes the roles of women, queens, priestesses, and mothers in traditional Nubian religious practices. In 2023, Dr. Ashby will join the faculty at UCLA in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. She will teach Egyptology and Nubian studies. Dr. Ashby is a founding member of the William Leo Hansberry Society, which seeks to create pathways for people of African descent, both on the continent and in the diaspora, to engage in the study of African antiquity. So, please join me in welcoming Dr. Solange Ashby.
Right, thank you, everyone. Thank you for that warm introduction. I'm very excited to be here in Baltimore again at the Walters with all of you. So this lecture highlights several objects held by the Walters Art Museum, focusing primarily on Meroitic artifacts. By providing cultural and historical context for these items, I will introduce the audience to the ancient kingdom of Meroë in the land called Nubia. Before I begin, allow me to take a moment to define terms, which can often sound like a word salad when presenting the ancient cultures of Nubia. Here I will use Nubia as a geographic term for the land now divided between southern Egypt and northern Sudan. I use the term Kush to describe a cultural unity of three ancient kingdoms located in the land of Nubia. Kush itself can be divided chronologically into three kingdoms, the oldest being Kerma, followed by Napata, and then finally Meroë. The kingdom of Meroë is the focus of my lecture today, but I would like to situate it in the larger history of Kush. Kush was Egypt's southern neighbor. Egypt and Kush were contemporaneous kingdoms sharing 3,000 years of parallel and often intertwined history from about 2600 BCE to about 300 CE, Common Era. Kerma, the oldest Kushite kingdom, lasted an astounding 1,000 years. Its rulers did not practice writing, nor were they depicted in art. Kerman rulers were buried under enormous earthen tumuli, mounds, surrounded by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of cattle skulls called bucrania. The kingdom of Kerma was a powerful military threat of Egypt during the Old Kingdom, the First Intermediate Period, and the Middle Kingdom. During the succeeding New Kingdom, Egypt became strong enough to attack and defeat Kerma, incorporating the land into the Egyptian Empire, which reached its greatest extent during this period, that of the New Kingdom. Under the pharaoh Thutmose III, the nephew of the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, Egypt controlled a region as far east as the Euphrates River in Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia, and far south into Nubia. There ensued a period of 500 years in which Egypt colonized Nubia, extracting gold, precious gemstones, cattle, and people. As Egyptian military might waned during the late New Kingdom, a powerful family arose near the city that would become Napata. After several generations, the Napatans were able to invade and conquer Egypt, to rule there for slightly less than 100 years as Egypt's Kushite 25th dynasty. When the Kushite king Taharko engaged Assyria in battle in the 8th century BCE, he provoked a powerful foe that ultimately expelled the Kushites from Egypt. And despite losing control of Egypt, the Napatan rulers returned to their homeland, where they continued to rule until approximately 300 BCE. Which brings us to the period under consideration today, the kingdom of Meroë. Whereas the Napatans had adopted many Egyptian cultural norms, worship of Egyptian gods, Egyptian kingship iconography, and even the Egyptian hieroglyphic writing system, Meroë marked a striking turn toward indigenous traditions. We begin to see during this period the worship of Meroitic gods, such as the lion-headed god Apetamak and his consort, the goddess Amasimi. It is during this period that the Meroitic script is developed and the emergence of a period of sole rule by women. Those queens were named Shanat-Dakekto, Nawitamak, Amani-Renas, Amani-Shaketo, and Amani-Tore. So, where is Nubia? Nubia, as I mentioned, is currently divided between southern Egypt and northern Sudan, an ancient land crossed by modern borders. 6 cataracts demarcate the land of Nubia. Cataracts consist of areas of the Nile in which the flow of the river is obstructed by boulders that create rapids in the river and impede boat traffic. Numbered from north to south, the cataracts mark important sites in Nubia. First cataract marks the northern border of Nubia and the southern border of Egypt in antiquity. The third cataract is the site of Kerma, capital of the oldest Kushite kingdom, while Napata is located at the fourth cataract. The sixth cataract marks the southern border of Nubia and the site of the capital city of Meroë. The map on the right is a more detailed map of Nubia showing Kerma, located here, in this case called Argo, again Napata, and all the way down here, Meroë, as well as some important temples in the vicinity of Meroë that I will refer to later. So let me just point out here, Musawarat as Sufra will be an important temple site, as well as Naka. And then I would like you just to note, and hopefully remember, this site of Dengel that is mentioned on that first artifact that I will discuss in just a few moments. Meroë city consisted of at least 4 cemeteries, including 2 royal cemeteries. The North Cemetery contained the pyramid burials of rulers located on a small hill to the east of the Nile River. The royal city was built closer down, next to the Nile. Meroë included royal baths in which this statue was discovered, and several temples were found in the city, among them the Lion Temple, located here, dedicated to that Meroitic god called Apetamak, which brings us to our first object, the votive plaque of King Tanya Day Amani. The plaque is made of dark red siltstone, or schist. It measures about 8 inches tall and 3 3/4 inches wide. Found in the Lion Temple at Meroë in 1909 by John Garstang, a British archaeologist from the University of Liverpool, who specialized in the area of Anatolia and the Levant. Garstang excavated at Meroë from 1909 to 1914, while Sudan was held as a British colony. The king depicted on this beautiful object, his name being Tanya Day Amani, wears an ornamented garment. A close-up shows the king's earrings with ram's heads, an allusion to the god Amun, closely associated with Napatan and Meroitic rulers. There would also have been 3 rams on his necklace, although that area is broken, unfortunately. The king also wears broad armlets and bracelets and a crown resembling that of Apetamak on the backside of the plaque. This crown is called a hemhem crown. Okay, pictured on the right there, which is composed of 3 bundles, probably of papyrus reeds, and then flanked by feathers on either side, crowned by uraei, rearing cobras. Hope that you can see that here, rearing cobras on either side, and supported on a pair of horizontal ram's horns, yet another allusion to the god Amun, who was frequently depicted as a ram. Hemhem in the Egyptian language means to shout or to cry out, perhaps referring to a battle cry. The text on the stela, shown in front and behind the king, is written in the Meroitic cursive script, in columns read from top to bottom, right to left. The Meroitic script has been deciphered, but the language itself cannot yet be fully translated. Developed from the cursive Egyptian Demotic script, it is greatly simplified in that the signs are alphabetic instead of pictographic, like the Egyptian hieroglyphs, making it so much easier to read. While we can read each individual sign, the grammar and much of the vocabulary of Meroitic remains untranslatable at this point, meaning that we are able to read about 100 words. What can be made out from the text on this stela? Those words are as follows. We see the god's name, Apetamak, mentioned quite early in the text, followed by the name of the king, Tanya de Amani, and then the Meroitic word for life, Horite, and then a command form of the verb to give, so give him, Elekete, and the name of a site. And that's why I wanted you to remember the location of that city called Dangel, that's a little bit north of Meroë, up by the Fifth Cataract. So what we read on the text is Dekari To. And Dekari then is thought to be the Meroitic word for this site called Dangel. Furthermore, we read the word Mano, which is the Meroitic name for the god Amun, that also appears as Amani in a lot of royal names, and the word Kore, which I'm going to translate here as king, but in this ungendered language, the term really just means ruler, and so it can also be used for those magnificent ruling queens that I am studying but won't talk about tonight. Happy to answer questions about them, though. And then the name of the god Apetamak appears again. The god's name also appears in the two columns behind the king, and this whole text is thought to record a hymn, the god Apetamak. I want to point out on the lower left of the screen there are two open access resources regarding this specific text. And so the top one is a publication that comes in 4 volumes, Fontes Historiae Nubiorum. This is from volume 2, and on those pages 671 to 2, they translate, or transliterate, I should say, this text in full and translate the words that we are able to understand at this point. And then the second is a citation for another open access article written by Claude Rie, who is the main person working on the Meroitic language, and he has kindly written an article for UCLA's Encyclopedia of Egyptology on the Meroitic language. So this votive plaque held here in the Walters, and another also by King Tanya de Amani held in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston are the earliest royal historical texts displaying the cursive Meroitic script. So really a priceless object. So let's look at the back side of the same plaque. On the reverse, we see the god Apetamak in his lion-headed form. He's holding a sorghum stalk. Here, that's a kind of grain that grows in northern Sudan and ancient Nubia and is the basis of much of their food, together with a scepter topped by a seated lion, an image of the god himself. The god also holds a coiled rope that ends in the Ankh sign, the Egyptian hieroglyph for life, yet depicted in a distinctly Meroitic form. You can see that there, here. So the text on this side of the votive plaque, we can make out fewer words, but we can read the word Ato, the Meroitic word for water, which gives its name to the Atbara River in Sudan, and then a series of words, Mek, Dekari, Te, and that translates Mek as the word for God in Dakari. Dangel, likely. And you might notice that that word Mach that I'm referring to also makes up part of the name for Epetamoc. So he is literally called the creator god in Meroitic. Epetamoc is depicted in the same form, wearing that hem crown at the Lion Temple at Musawarat as Sufra that I pointed out to you down by the capital city of Meroë, and that was built around the 3rd century BCE. And again at the Lion Temple at Naka, another one of those temples in the vicinity of Meroë. At Naka, he's depicted in exactly this form, with that hem crown, holding the scepter topped by the seated lion, and again holding this coiled rope with the ox sign. So it seems to be very much part of his iconography. And that temple of Naka was built by several rulers in the 1st century BC or 1st century CE. And this is the period when we have those 5 sole ruling queens. So likely built under the reign of one of these powerful women. A divine triad from Musawarat as Sufra depicts 2 lion gods wearing the hem crowns on either side of a central figure. In this case, the ram-headed god Amun. And this beautiful artifact is held in the National Museum in Khartoum. It is clear that the symbolism of the lion was potent in Meroitic religion and kingship iconography. The lion god Epetamoc was associated with creation and war, as I mentioned, yet the lion also represents the power and ferocity of the Meroitic ruler. Elsewhere, we see images of the ruler seated on a lion throne, for example, in the funerary chapels at the royal burials at Meroë. On temple facades, we see lions mauling prisoners at the feet of the ruler. So I'm thinking of the lion temple at Naka with the king next to the queen, both of them smiting enemies who are being mauled by lions under their feet. Furthermore, lion gods feature prominently in Egyptian myths about Nubia. 2 primordial sibling gods, Tefnut, a goddess, and Shu, a god, appear in the form of lions. The myth of the distant goddess tells us that Tefnut had to be enticed to return to Egypt from Nubia, where she had assumed the form of a lioness and wandered in the deserts in southeastern Nubia. This very cute little figure is also available to see on the 2nd floor in the same case as that votive plaque of Tanya Dayamani. So to put Meroë in its larger geopolitical context, let us now look first at the enemies/neighbors/subject people of Meroë within Nubia, those being the Noba, and the Blemies, later called Beja, and then look to Meroë's neighbors, Roman Egypt to the north and the kingdom of Aksum to the east. This object is not held in the Walters, but I thought it was a very powerful image to share with you. The Noba were a people who lived west of the Nile River in the hills of Kordofan and descended into the Nile Valley during the time of the Kingdom of Meroë. Meroitic sources and classical Greek writers describe the arrival of the Noba and the battles fought by Meroë to repulse them. Here we see a small statuette found in Meroë that depicts a bound prisoner. The Meroitic text inscribed on the figure, which you can see running along the hip and the thigh, here, tells us, quote, "This is the king of the Noba." This bronze lamp is held at the Walters, also on display on the 2nd floor. Bronze lamps were found in several burials, including royal burials. You might imagine such a lamp being left behind in the dark burial chamber after the appropriate funerary rites had been conducted and the tomb sealed forever. This one is about 4 inches wide and 4 inches deep, 10 inches long. The lamp would have been hung by the shackles around the neck of this bound prisoner. The prisoner's arms are pinioned to his legs. It really is quite a violent image of enemy people of the Meroitic kingdom. The opening for the flames extends from the prisoner's anus, further degrading him. The fire of the lamp would have burned in his belly. There's also a so-called maker's mark on the shoulder of the prisoner, which is very interesting. This is a symbol that I see engraved into the walls of royal burials, but also at the Temple of Philae, where Nubians arrived over hundreds of years as pilgrims and priests conducting rites in the temple. There's a lot more to know about these maker's marks. Another beautiful bronze lamp, this one held in the Museum of Fine Arts, was discovered in the burial of King Takade Amani, who reigned in the 2nd century CE. Decorated with a flame guard in the form of an agapanthus leaf, it would have been hung by this griffin's head hook at the top. The lamp also is inscribed with the maker's mark as well as a Meroitic language inscription, probably naming the high-ranking person who donated this lamp to the king's burial. This object, also held at the Walters, is a beige shield, typically made of rhinoceros or hippopotamus hide. Although 20th century in date, the shield may be similar to protective gear used by the Blemmies, an ancient enemy of Meroë. The Beja are a nomadic population resident in the eastern desert in Nubia and Egypt, and likely descendants of the Blemmies, who are mentioned in Meroitic texts, classical Greek sources, as well as Aksumite texts from Ethiopia. During the Pharaonic period, Blemmies served as desert guides for Egyptian trade missions, as well as mercenaries and policemen for the Egyptian state. Military use of the camel was introduced into Egypt in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE during the Assyrian and then later Persian invasions into Egypt. Riding camels, Blemmies became a lightning-fast strike force, attacking into Egypt and harassing the kingdom of Meroë, which attempted to rule them as vassals. So let's situate Meroë in the context of the wider world. The kingdom of Meroë, it dates again 300 BCE to 300 CE, was contemporary with 300 years of Ptolemaic Greek rule in Egypt, and then 300 years of Roman rule in Egypt. To the east, the ascendant kingdom of Aksum was gaining power in what is today Ethiopia during the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, reaching its classical period between 160 and 360 CE. So these two powerful neighbors, Aksum to the east and Roman Egypt to the north. We'll look at a few items also in the Walters collection to depict these neighboring civilizations. So I will step away from the notes for a minute. I just wanted to point out here, this stela is dedicated by one of these sole ruling queens named Amani-Shaketo, who is depicted in the center here, being ushered into the presence of the lion god Apetamak by his consort Amasimi, who holds the queen by her elbow, introducing her to Apetamak. Below the triad, so the two gods and the queen, we can see bound prisoners who are being trampled on by the folks in the upper part of the stela. This is just a closer image of those prisoners. And what we see to the left of the leftmost prisoner is written in Meroitic script Tamea, which seems to be a generic ethnonym designating a white man, and probably derives from the Egyptian term Chemehu, that was to refer to the Libyans. And so for the Meroitic rulers, those would have been the lighter-skinned people in northern Africa. On the left, you can see the head of the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus, and Strabo, the Greek historian who was contemporary with these Meroitic rulers, tells us of an attack by Meroë into Egypt, in which the Meroitic troops overran the towns of Aswan, Philae, and Elephantine, toppling statues of Caesar. In this case, the head was separated from a statue of the emperor in Egypt and brought down to Meroë, where it was buried under the steps of the Sun Temple in the city of Meroë, a temple dedicated to military victories. And this positioning would have allowed the then ruling queen to trample his head every time she ascended to the Sun Temple. Okay. All right, so what was happening then in Egypt, Roman-ruled Egypt? What we have on the left is an example from the Walters collection of some beautiful Roman mummy portraits. These were all found in a northern Egyptian site called the Fayum, so a created lake area to the west of the Nile, south of Cairo, but still in the northern part of Egypt. These mummy portraits form a hybrid cultural practice in which the deceased was prepared for burial in a traditional Egyptian fashion by being mummified, and yet the inclusion of a true likeness of the deceased in the form of this portrait attached to the outer cartonnage is an innovation of the Roman period. We'll look at a few more in just a moment. On the right, I've included an Aksumite coin, and we'll look a little bit more closely at the imagery on these coins to talk about the transition that happens at this time in Aksum from traditional indigenous religion to Christianity. So these are some of the beautiful Roman mummy portraits held in the Walters Art Museum. The one on the left is dated to the late 1st century. The one in the center dated more precisely to 170 to 180 CE. And the one on the far right, this beautiful woman with her jewelry, is dated also to the 2nd century CE. And we see some distinctions in sort of ethnic characteristics of the people there. This is a result of the very multi-ethnic nature of Egyptian society at this time. All right, so finally to the contemporary kingdom of Aksum, located in what is today the highlands of Ethiopia and Eritrea. The Aksumite kingdom began to issue coins in around 270 CE. This was a foreign practice not generally adopted in northeastern Africa. The Greeks introduced the use of coins into Egypt in the 7th century BCE. The kingdom of Meroë never adopted the use of coinage. Aksumite adoption of this practice speaks to its increasing participation in the trade networks of Northeast Africa, previously dominated by Meroë, which would fall in the next couple of decades. So the end of Meroë is around 300 CE, as a result of attacks from a population called the Noba, coming from the west, and the Aksumites coming from the east. In fact, the Aksumite king Ezana, who is the first to convert to Christianity, set up a throne in the city of Meroë, proclaiming his victory over the Meroitic rulers. So this probably was the end of the kingdom of Meroë. Back at Aksum, the silver and bronze coins were issued for local everyday use and generally followed a design of Roman coins with a bust portrait of the ruler in profile on one side. Please notice the difference between the coin in the center, that silver coin, and those on either side of it. The center coin displays an upturned crescent moon surmounted by a star. There above the ruler's head, this is the symbol of the god Almaka, and so pre-Christian worship, while the coins on either side carry the symbol of the cross. You can see here, and again there. And I just want to point out it looks very much like the Ankh sign that is at the end of that coiled rope held by a petamak. And so very interesting. Aksumite coins were the first in the ancient world to carry the cross as a symbol of the ruler's devotion to the Christian religion. Coinage then provides a visual history of the changing religious beliefs of Aksumite kings. So that was a quick whirlwind tour through the history of Northeast Africa based on the items being held here in the Walters. I hope you all will take advantage of this fabulous resource and go see these items in person. So I'll conclude with that, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For those of you who I have not yet met, I'm Lisa Anderson-Jew. I am the curator of ancient Mediterranean art here at the Walters Art Museum. And I am delighted to have heard this really deep dive into our objects, sort of bringing life areas of the collection that have been maybe ignored a little bit or underinterpreted, especially our Nubian collection is very small. So we are going to be passing around microphones as needed. So if you have questions, go ahead and put up your hands, and I will just sort of kick this off as we wait for a question, which I know there will be some. But what was fascinating to me is we're talking about the lion-headed god. And in Egyptian culture, what we see are a variety of animals who are connected with the gods, particularly falcons or Hathor with the cattle. And it was essentially really focused on the lions. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about why that might be. Are there more lions in this part of Africa? You had mentioned that cattle was really important, but then a ram was part of the triad and not cattle. So I just wondered, why the intense focus on the majestic, very powerful lion?
Okay, yes. Yes, you're right. Animal imagery is everywhere in Egyptian religion. So Horus, who the king is seen to be a manifestation of, is taken in the form of a falcon. Hathor, as you mentioned, is in the form of a cow. The Egyptian king can be assimilated or represented as a lion, but it is certainly much more prominent in these Nubian kingdoms to the south. And I'm sure that's because the range where we would find lions living is not coming all the way up into Egypt. So they would have been indigenous, local, living in these lands of Nubia. The people would have been much more just aware of lions, and it became a very potent, powerful image for the strength, ferocity, and domination of these Kushite kings, whereas in Egypt we see the power, strength, and domination of the king being associated to a bull. And so that is one just straightforward distinction between the two cultures.
Thank you. Up front.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. You mentioned that we had managed to decipher the Meroë script and that we have identified about 100 words. But you also mentioned that it is an ungendered language. And I'm wondering if you can speak to any extent about how it is that we made that determination. Was it based on vocabulary, or is there some of the grammar that we do understand? How do we know that?
So yes, thank you for that question. As a language person, I love to talk about it, but I'm not always sure people want to hear the minutia. So Africa has 4 major language families, and 3 of them connect in the Middle Nile Valley here. So it's a very potent mixed place linguistically. The Egyptian language and the Cushitic languages of the Beja Blemis, those belong to Afro-Asiatic. And Arabic and Hebrew then are the 2 of 3 languages in this family that are not found on the African continent. The Meroitic languages, the Nubian languages, Maasai, and some other languages in Ethiopia belong to the Nilo-Saharan languages that kind of stretch east to west in this area. And they are part of their characteristic is that they don't use gender. So Egyptian is very clear in always having a bare noun, if you will, be masculine, and then it's marked by a T at the end to indicate feminine. Whereas in the Nubian languages, gender is not marked. And for me, this is very powerful because it is also, as I'm finding in my research, there is much more of a gender balance in these cultures as well, that we see women being very prominent, being very central parts of the culture. And I think that this is reflected in the language, so that you can have a word, quare, meaning ruler, and that can be used equally by a woman ruler or a male ruler. And I tend to translate it as ruler simply because queen in our language does not imply the full authority and power of a sole ruler. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah. What's that? Yes. Yes. The problem with this language, English, that we're using is that it doesn't have the culture and history behind it of powerful females, either as goddesses, rulers, women, honored women. And so we are lacking the proper words to translate these ancient terms.
And another question over there, I'll just repeat that he was saying sovereign might be a word that could be used as a gender-neutral ruler.
I was wondering, what are the missing pieces in figuring out more of the vocabulary? Are we looking at trying to find more artifacts? Are we looking towards languages that are still being spoken or certain dialects? Like, where are the missing, kind of focus on the missing pieces to understanding more vocabulary?
Yes, you have identified the 2 crucial problems here. So the Nubian culture was not as obsessed with writing as the Egyptians were. If anyone's been to Egypt, seen an Egyptian temple, they cover every single available space of a wall with either an image or hieroglyphic text, right? And they kept meticulous records on papyri. Nubia is a different culture. I'm imagining that it's more of an oral culture. We just don't have as many texts preserved. Mainly what we have are very sort of typical standard phrases for funerary texts. And so it's a very limited vocabulary, but that allows us to understand kinship terms, mother, father, sister. And so, yes, we could use more text to have a broader range, but another part of the problem is that we haven't had a lot of deep linguistic research done into the related languages of the Nilo-Saharan family. to which Meroitic belongs, and the modern Nubian languages. And that, unfortunately, is because the areas where we could go to collect this linguistic information are war-torn. And so one of the homelands of the Nilo-Saharan languages is in Darfur, and it's just not a safe place for people to go and do language research. And so that is a big part of the problem. What Claude Rie, whose article I referred to, is trying to do is recreate the proto-language to see if he can then figure out the grammar of the Meroitic language, but we're missing a lot of pieces.
There's one right there.
And then there as well.
Hi, Dr. Ashby. Thank you for your talk. I just had a question kind of related to, on the same vein of war-torn regions and Egyptian temples. What is the state of the preservation of some of these Meroitic temples, and the archaeology within the region of northern Sudan? That's pretty much it.
Good question. I've only been able to travel to Sudan once. I was there in 2014. I was able to visit the Temple of Musawarat as-Sufra, which is really beautifully preserved, and there are almost no tourists there, so it's just lovely to be in a site by myself with the driver, just feeling like I'm a priestess from 2,000 years ago. I also went to visit the Royal Cemetery, Begarawia North at Meroë, and those are pyramids. Unfortunately, some Italian treasure hunter named Giuseppe Ferlini blew off the top of these royal pyramids to try to find gold. And he unfortunately was successful in finding a cache of gold jewelry from one of these sole ruling queens, Amani Shaketo, who I showed on the stela. Each of these royal pyramid burials has a funerary chapel coming out of the east side, and the interior walls of those chapels were beautifully decorated. A lot of that decoration has now degraded, and it's become more and more difficult to read the texts that are there or see the relief decoration, which is unfortunate. Also, unfortunately, the rising groundwater is threatening these funerary chapels as well. And so, yeah. I was working with two young women who are starting an architectural school in Sudan, and they are trying to attract architecture students to try to figure out ways to build protection around these royal cemeteries at Meroë to protect them from the rising groundwater. But as always, it's a question of money, right? I was not able to get to the Temple of Naka. I hope someday soon to be able to get back to Sudan. I'll just say that it is beautiful to be able to visit these sites without a lot of tourists. It really is a magical experience to be on this hill overlooking the Nile below, and then just drifts of sand dunes and silence.
Thank you so much for that fantastic talk, Dr. Ashby. I learned so much. I'm here with my course at Johns Hopkins on race before race, and we've talked so much about the need to have versions of antiquity that are not centered around Greece and Rome, so you're giving us some wonderful material. At the same time, some of this material is about the violent subjection of ethnic others. So I'm curious if we were so lucky as to have you take a day of our class, what story would you tell through this material about race and racecraft in the ancient world?
Related to the violence?
Or just any story that you would pull out of this that would relate to people who are kind of looking to antiquity to understand modern racial formations.
Interesting, huh? It's interesting. In my mind, this is just ancient history, and it is not really about race. It absolutely is race before race, right? because for all of these people, and it's true, I want to hold up the symbolism of these powerful ruling queens as like a feminist icon. But they also are showing themselves on the pylons, bashing in the heads of their military enemies, right? And so this is imperialism and empire in action. But in this context, there is no race involved. Everyone is African. You know, in our American lingo, they're all Black people. It's just different ethnic groups, different populations who are trying to control land and resources, or alternately trying to remain free of control. And so those Beja Blemi people are a really good example of folks who remained nomadic, who eluded control. The Meroites are forever now going out and trying to control them, to have them be a subject population, and are not successful. So I think I've sort of evaded your question. It's all African history.
But I mean, just to engage with that as we near the end of our time, you and I were just discussing in the galleries before your talk, and one of the slides you showed talking with the generic term for a white person.
Yeah.
And if you come to our galleries, there's the Egyptian power case that talks about symbols of power. And we were discussing how the art that we have doesn't actually tell a full story, because we have like a Black Nubian who's shown as a captive, but the way these were normally depicted, and as you had partially in your slide, is that it was a range of ethnicities. And you know, there was like this emphasis on difference to show, I'm so powerful, I've conquered the entire world, and look at all these strange people that I've conquered, and just really emphasizing difference and, you know, subjugation. And so like there's just, it's like making it more other in some ways to prove a symbolic, powerful point.
Yes, and then you continued as we were having this conversation upstairs that what is missing from that case is, for the ancient Egyptians, they were also shown dominating the people from the Levant, right? Or those Libyans to the west. Everybody, all of their neighbors in ancient Egypt were sort of the 9 bows that had to be dominated. And this was absolutely not a racial thing. It was, are you living in the Nile Valley? Even if you come as an ethnic other and adopt Egyptian traditions, you are then an Egyptian, right? And I'll be talking about exactly this tomorrow at the University of Pennsylvania, a lecture on borders. And so, but that's a whole other topic for a different day.
But it's just fascinating the way that they take on other people's symbols of power. Like, and I thought it was very interesting as you were we see the symbols of Egyptian power that the Meroitic rulers are taking on with the hem crowns. But then, you know, in Egypt, the Egyptians take on some Roman symbols, but also the Romans take on the pharaonic symbols to also take on their power. So my one final question, I hope that I'm not stepping on anybody else's. You mentioned that the Meroitic peoples invaded Roman Egypt, and that had that kind of relationship, but I did wonder, were there any symbols of Roman power that we see Meroë taking on, or was it entirely reaction against?
Good question. Yes, so just to your first point, I would like to just tell the audience, I wrote my dissertation about the Temple of Philae, and there are images of the Roman Emperor Augustus all over the forecourt area of the temple, because he was funding the building of this area, and he is depicted 100% as an Egyptian pharaoh, right? You would never recognize him as a Roman, except for he has his name in a cartouche, this sign that surrounds the royal names, and he's called Geyseris, right? So the Caesar, but very much Egyptian presentation. I probably should have made it a bit more explicit when I was showing that map of Meroë, and I was talking about the royal baths that were found there. That image of the woman, while looking very African, it is not at all typical of Meroitic art. And so These are Meroitic artisans depicting a nude woman in sort of a Roman form to be part of the baths that seem to be a tradition that they're adopting from Rome. There's also at the Temple of Naka, again in the vicinity of Meroë, a kiosk that is looking very Roman in form, but has Meroitic practices that are definitely indigenous. So there's a little area where people are bringing stones that are from a meteorite that they have collected in the desert, and they're bringing them as offerings at the temple. And this is a very indigenous Nubian Meroitic practice that's happening in this temple that looks very Roman. And so they are excellent at picking and choosing cultural motifs from Egypt, from Greece, from Rome, and combining them with their own indigenous traditions in ways that are very novel, very interesting, very unique. Very much part of the larger ancient world, which is what I was trying to do with this lecture, that Meroë is not a random kingdom off at the edges of the civilized world, if you will, but was very much engaged in religious practices, in trade, especially with the larger world.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really wonderful. And please, let's thank Dr. Ashby again for...
What an incredible presentation, Dr. Ashby. Thank you so much for being here this evening with us and for sharing your insights. And thanks all of you for joining us today and for your continued support of the Walters. Support from the Boshell Foundation and from all of you keeps museum admission and exhibitions free. It conserves our collection and creates arts programs for families, students, and adults. Thank you, and have a great evening.